Never rat on your friends, and always keep your mouth shut. That is the lesson. In Goodfellas, Robert De Niro's Jimmy Conway crouches beside a bloodied teenage Henry Hill outside a courthouse, presses a roll of bills into the kid's hand, and gives him the 2 commandments that will govern the rest of his life. It is the warmest scene in the movie. A grown man teaching a frightened boy that loyalty is the only thing in this world that matters. That's the movie version. That's what Hollywood sold you. The man who really said those words was named James Burke. And within about 6 months of the biggest robbery of his life, he would hunt down and murder the friends who could talk. The boy he taught to keep his mouth shut would be the one who opened it in a federal courtroom and buried him with it. They called him Jimmy the Gent, and the nickname came from a habit. When Burke and his crew hijacked a truck, he took the driver's license, the same as everyone else did, so the man would understand that they now knew exactly where he lived and exactly where his family slept. But Burke did one thing none of the others ever did. He folded a $50 bill into the driver's wallet before he handed it back. A robbery and a tip, from the same hand, in the same motion. That $50 bill is the single most important thing to understand about Jimmy Burke. Because the real question was never how many trucks he took, or how many men he was rumored to have killed. The question the record actually answers is colder than that. Who was Jimmy Burke dangerous to? Not the truck drivers. He tipped those. Not the police, and not the rival crews across Queens. The people who had the most to fear from Jimmy Burke were the ones who trusted him the most, the ones who took his money and his smile and felt lucky to be close to him. And the version of that story you have not heard is worse than anything in the film. This story does not start with a robbery. It starts with a boy nobody wanted. James Burke was born in New York City on July the 5th, 1931. His mother was a young Irish woman named Jane Conway, and the name on the boy's earliest records was not Burke at all. It was Conway. He was born out of wedlock, he never knew his father, and before he was 2 years old, he had been handed into the foster care system, where he stayed. When Martin Scorsese changed the character's name to Jimmy Conway for the film, he had no way of knowing that he was quietly handing the man back the name he was actually born with. By the account in Nicholas Pileggi's book Wise Guy, the source Scorsese built the movie on, and by the obituaries printed after Burke died, his childhood was a long procession of foster homes, and the violence inside some of them was severe. He was moved from house to house, and in his own later telling, he was beaten and abused. When he was around 13 years old, an argument with his foster parents inside a moving car ended in a crash that killed the foster father. The boy walked away. Something in him did not. Whatever softness a child is supposed to carry out of those years seems to have been gone before Jimmy Burke was old enough to drive. What grew in its place was charm, and the charm was the weapon. This is the part the film gets right and then never bothers to explain. Burke was likable. He was generous to a fault. Fast with a roll of cash, the man who bought the round, covered the tab, and slipped the 50 into the frightened driver's wallet. His generosity was not the opposite of his violence. It was the delivery system for it. People relaxed around Jimmy Burke. They let him close. And that closeness was the whole point. Henry Hill, who idolized him as a teenager, would put it plainly years later. He said Burke would kill anyone in a heartbeat. And in almost the same breath, he said that when he met Jimmy Burke in 1964, Burke practically owned Kennedy Airport, and that if you asked him, they had named the airport after the wrong Irishman. By the 1960s, Burke was an associate of the Lucchese crime family, working under a capo named Paul Vario out of Brooklyn and Queens. Hold on to that detail, because the audience for this story always checks it. Lucchese, not Gambino, and associate, not made man. Burke was Irish, and the Italian-American mafia did not formally induct men who were not of Italian blood. He could earn for them, steal for them, kill for them, and run an entire crew of his own for them. He could never actually become one of them, a man who spends his whole life proving his worth to an organization that will never fully let him inside, is a particular kind of dangerous, because he has to be twice as useful and twice as ruthless as the men born into it. Burke was exactly that. His headquarters was a bar called Robert's Lounge on Lefferts Boulevard in South Ozone Park, Queens, a few minutes from the airport cargo terminals that fed him. From there, he ran a hijacking operation out of the freight yards that were still called Idlewild when he started, and later became Kennedy. Trucks rolled off those terminals loaded with cash, cigarettes, electronics, clothing, and Burke's crew took them, sometimes with inside tips on which trailer held what. Pileggi records that Burke loved to unload the stolen trucks himself, tearing into the cartons until the sweat ran down his face, happy as a kid turned loose in a candy store. He was not a boss who stayed clean at a comfortable distance. He liked the work. And behind Robert's lounge, according to Hill, there was a patch of ground the crew used as a bocce court that Hill described as Jimmy's makeshift graveyard. Keep that ground in mind. We are coming back to it. Around him, he gathered the men who would become famous 40 years later on a movie screen. A half-Irish, half-Sicilian kid named Henry Hill, who worshipped him. A violent, unstable enforcer named Tommy DeSimone. An earner named Angelo Sepe. Burke was the sun they all orbited. He taught them how to steal, how to carry themselves, how to spread money around so people looked the other way, and above all, how to keep their mouths shut when the law came asking. Remember that last lesson? He built his entire world on it, and in the end, it was the one lesson none of them kept. In 1972, Burke and Hill were convicted of extortion down in Florida, after beating a man named Gasperi Ciaccio over a gambling debt owed to a union boss in Tampa. Burke drew a 10-year sentence and went to the federal penitentiary at Lewisburg in Pennsylvania. He served about 6 years and came home to Queens. And here's the detail that should sit in the back of your mind for the next half hour. In a life that ran across 4 decades, that touched dozens of hijackings and a body count men still argue about today, the government could only ever make one murder charge stick to Jimmy Burke. Exactly one. And it is the one killing that Goodfellas never once shows you as his. Picture the man for a second. The most generous guy in the room. The one who tips the driver he just robbed. The one who tells a terrified teenager that the highest virtue on earth is loyalty to your friends. And also the one man at the table who quietly decides which of those friends is going to come home tonight and which one is not. In Henry Hill's position, would you keep taking the envelopes and telling yourself the smile was just a smile? Or would you already be working out your exit? Tell me in the comments. And if you're new here, subscribe. I pull these cases from trial transcripts and federal records every single week because the envelopes were about to get much, much bigger. By 1978, Burke had his hands in something that had nothing to do with a truck. It started, of all places, on a college basketball court, 3 states away. A pair of brothers from Pittsburgh, Rocco and Anthony Perla, had a scheme to fix games at Boston College. The plan was not to make the team lose outright. It was subtler than that. It was point shaving, keeping the winning margin under the number the bookmakers had set, so that the men in on the fix could bet against the spread and collect no matter who won the game. The player they turned was a reserve forward named Rick Kuhn. What the Perlas did not have was the money and the muscle to run a real operation. Henry Hill did, and Hill brought it straight to Jimmy Burke and Paul Vario. That is the reach of this man. He was a Queens truck hijacker who had barely finished a stretch in Lewisburg, and now he was quietly holding a piece of a point-shaving ring buried inside a college athletic program in Massachusetts. The first game they leaned on, against Providence in early December, was a test, and it failed. Boston College won by too much and blew the spread. So they tightened the screws. Over that winter, the fix men worked their way through a run of games. Some went perfectly. When Boston College beat Connecticut by exactly the right margin in January, Hill remembered the payoff word that came back down the line: beautiful. Others went wrong in ways that showed exactly how much money and temper were riding on college kids. When a nationally televised game against Holy Cross slipped out of their control in February, Hill later described Burke's reaction with a detail no screenwriter would dare invent. "Jimmy went nuts," he said. He put his foot through his own television set. The scheme held together for a season and then came apart the way these things always do, through the man who talked. When it reached a federal courtroom in Brooklyn in the fall of 1981, Burke was convicted of racketeering conspiracy, sports bribery, and interstate travel to commit bribery. And this is a number the record insists on getting right, because it gets repeated wrong constantly. Jimmy Burke was sentenced to 20 years. Not 12, 20. Rick Kuhn, the player, was handed a 10-year sentence, at that time the harshest term any college athlete had ever received for shaving points, before an appeals court cut it down to 28 months. The judge said the courts had an obligation to defend the integrity of the game. Henry Hill, who had carried the entire scheme to Burke in the first place, was named as a co-conspirator and charged with nothing at all. Because by the time that courtroom convened, Hill had already made the trade that ends this whole story. But that comes later. For now, hold a different image. Somewhere in the middle of 1978, a man who worked at the Lufthansa cargo terminal at Kennedy Airport got himself deep into gambling debt. His name was Louis Werner. He had been with the airline for about 10 years, and he owed somewhere around $20,000, money he had lost through a betting runner who steered him to a bookmaker named Martin Krugman. Werner knew something that almost nobody outside that terminal knew. Roughly once a month, Lufthansa flew a shipment of American cash back to New York, currency that servicemen and travelers had spent and exchanged over in West Germany, all of it bundled up and shipped home to a bank. Between the plane and the bank, that money sat overnight in a vault behind a door that a man on the inside could open. Werner had even robbed the terminal once before, a smaller job in 1976 with a co-worker for about $22,000, and gotten away clean. He knew the room, he knew the schedule, he knew the locks. Werner talked. He talked to Krugman, who ran a wig shop on Lefferts Boulevard and took Henry Hill's action, and Krugman carried the tip to Hill, and Hill carried it, like every good tip he ever came across, straight to Jimmy Burke. One investigator later described the chain of whispers as knee bone to thigh bone to Burke. Werner even told them the timing. A large shipment had landed that Friday and would sit in the vault untouched all weekend. On the morning of the robbery, he called Robert's Lounge himself to confirm the money was really there. Everything was in place. He just didn't yet know what it was building toward. On the night of December the 11th, 1978, a black Ford van pulled up to Building 261 at the Lufthansa cargo area at Kennedy Airport, a little after 3 in the morning. The men who climbed out were Burke's, Tommy DeSimone, Angelo Sepe, a heavyset earner named Joe Manry, who everyone called Buddha, Luis Cafora, a hard case from the Gambino family named Paolo Licastri, on loan for the night, Robert McMahon, known to everyone as Frenchie. Burke's own son, Frank, waited outside in a second car, ready to ram anyone who tried to follow, and a small-time associate named Parnell Edwards, who everyone called Stacks, had one job and one job only. When it was over, he was to drive the van to a junkyard and have it crushed into a cube of scrap metal. Inside, the crew moved like they had memorized the floor plan, because they had. Werner and another inside man had drawn them the map. They took the cargo agent who spotted the van first, pistol-whipped him, dragged him in, took his wallet, and told him they knew where he lived. They rounded up the night staff, around 10 workers, and handcuffed them. But the money was behind a double-door vault system, a trap, where one door had to close before the other would open, or an alarm would ring straight through to the airport police. Only the night manager knew how to work it. They marched him down 2 flights of stairs to a room about 10 feet by 20, and made him open it without tripping the alarm. He would tell investigators afterward that the robbers were well informed, that they seemed to know everything about the safety systems in that vault. No shots were fired. Nobody was beaten beyond that first man. For a little over an hour, they loaded the cartons into the van, and then they were gone, out to a garage in Canarsie, where Jimmy Burke was waiting for them. The take was $5 million in cash, and another $875,000 in jewelry. At that single moment, it was the largest cash robbery ever committed on American soil. Burke had pulled off the perfect crime. Not one of the men who walked into that terminal was ever convicted of the heist itself. The only person who ever went to prison for the Lufthansa robbery was Louis Werner, the clerk who leaked the tip. And he was undone not by the crew, but by the people closest to him, a co-worker who cooperated, and a girlfriend named Janet Barbieri, who had heard him brag and who broke down on the witness stand and told a grand jury what she knew. Werner got 15 years. He would later trade his cooperation for a reduced sentence and vanish into witness protection. Almost none of the nearly $6 million was ever recovered. To this day, the only money the government ever got back was around $20,000, found on Werner himself. And this is the part where it stopped being business. Because the perfect crime had one flaw, and the flaw was people. Burke had somewhere between 6 and a dozen men who knew, for a fact, that he was behind the biggest robbery in the country. Every one of them wanted his cut. Every one of them, under the right pressure in the wrong interrogation room, could give the FBI the one name they wanted most. And Burke understood something that December with total, chilling clarity. A secret shared by 10 men is not a secret. It is 10 separate doors the whole thing can walk out through. Henry Hill described the arithmetic his boss ran in the plainest terms anyone ever put to it. He said that rather than hand everyone $400,000 or $500,000 apiece, it was simply easier for Jimmy to put a quarter bullet in their heads. So that is what he started to do. The first flaw revealed itself almost at once. Stax Edwards, the one man whose only assignment was to make the van disappear, got high, or got careless, and left it parked on a Brooklyn street next to a fire hydrant. The police towed it. Inside, the crime lab lifted his fingerprints off the wheel, and out at the airport they matched a muddy shoe print to the tread of his Puma sneakers. Edwards had handed the FBI the exact physical evidence Burke had planned to crush into scrap. About a week after the robbery, Tommy DeSimone and Angelo Sepe walked into Stax Edwards' apartment in Queens and shot him roughly 6 times. He was 31 years old. He was the first of the crew to die, and the reason he died was a parking spot. The retirement plan, for men who worked with Jimmy Burke, tended to be a shallow one. Then it accelerated. Martin Krugman, the bookmaker who had carried the tip up the chain, wanted his end, and he pushed for it, and he would not stop talking about it. He was reportedly owed as much as $500,000, and he made the mistake of reminding people. In early January of 1979, Krugman left to meet men connected to the crew and never came home. His body has never been found. Years later, a court declared him legally dead, and his wife collected on a life insurance policy, which is the closest thing to a funeral Martin Krugman ever got. By the spring of that year, the crew was thinning fast. Luis Cafora, a heavy-set parking lot owner who had actually shared a prison cell with Burke years before, made 2 mistakes. He bought his wife a pink Cadillac, a bright, loud, unmissable car, at exactly the moment the only smart move on earth was to look broke, and he reportedly began to think out loud about talking to the FBI. Cafora and his wife Joanna both disappeared in March. Their bodies were never recovered either. Joanna went with him for a simple, brutal reason. She knew too much. If that pink Cadillac is ringing a bell, it should, because the movie kept it. In Goodfellas, there is a Christmas party scene where Jimmy Conway sees that one of his crew has bought his wife a white Cadillac and a fur coat with the heist money, and he detonates. "Don't buy anything," he snarls at him. "Don't get anything. Nothing big." On screen, it plays as paranoia, a control freak coming apart over a car. What the film never tells you is that the man who bought the real pink Cadillac and the wife he bought it for both vanished off the face of the earth, and that no one has ever found so much as a bone. You'd think, watching your friends disappear one by one that winter, that someone would have said something, that someone would have run. Nobody did. That is the terrible gravity of a man like Burke. To run was to confirm you were a problem, and to confirm you were a problem was to become the next name on the list. 2 more of them, Joe Buddha Manry and Frenchie McMahon, had both worked the cargo terminals and helped plan the job, and both of them had refused to go into witness protection. In the middle of May, garbage men found them shot to death in the front seat of a Buick parked on a Brooklyn street. Each had been shot once in the back of the head. The car was a 2-door, and the killer had been sitting in the back, which meant that after the shots, he had to climb over the bodies of the 2 men to get out. About a month after that, Paolo Licastri, the Gambino man who had been lent out for the robbery, turned up shot and half-naked, dumped on Flatlands Avenue in an area where people left things they wanted gone. In the space of roughly half a year, the crew that had pulled off the perfect robbery had been reduced to almost nothing. The money had made them visible, visibility had made them liabilities, and Burke did the math on each of them in turn. And it was not only the men. Teresa Ferrara was a beautician, an occasional girlfriend of Tommy DeSimone, and, unknown to the crew, an informant who had already been talking to federal agents. She knew about the heist. On the 10th of February, she got a phone call at her salon, told a relative she had a chance to make $10,000, and left, leaving her purse, her keys, and her mink coat behind her. Months later, a dismembered torso washed up in the water off the New Jersey coast. They identified Teresa Ferrara by the serial numbers on her surgical implants. No one was ever convicted of it. I want to be exact here, because this is a room full of people who will check the work. Tommy DeSimone also disappeared in this same stretch, in January of 1979, and for years, the two events got folded into one story. But by the most credited account, the one Henry Hill gave, DeSimone was not killed by Burke to protect the Lufthansa secret. He was taken by the Gambino family, in retaliation for murdering one of their made men years earlier without permission. That killing sits right next to the purge in time, but it belongs on a different page of the ledger, and honest history keeps them apart. Angelo Sepe survived the purge entirely, only to be murdered years later by his own family over an unrelated robbery. The point was never that Burke killed every man who ever stood near him. The point is that when Jimmy Burke decided the cost of keeping you alive had finally passed the cost of killing you, being his friend became the single most dangerous thing you could be. By the 24th of March, 1979, with the bodies still turning up, investigators said out loud what the neighborhood already knew. They publicly tied at least 5 murders to what they called a low-level organized crime group, headed by James Burke. So we come back to the question we started with. What made Jimmy Burke so dangerous? And now you can see the answer taking its real shape, and it is not the answer the movie hands you. Goodfellas tells you Jimmy Conway was dangerous because he was a professional, cool, disciplined, the guy who plans the score and keeps his head while everyone else loses theirs. All of that is true, and all of it misses the actual thing. Watch the film again with the record open beside you, and the same 4 scenes read completely differently. Start with that very first scene. Never rat on your friends. Always keep your mouth shut. On screen it is a code, a beautiful and doomed code, the thing these men supposedly lived and died by. In reality, the man delivering that sermon spent the winter of 1978 murdering his friends precisely so that they would never get the chance to rat, because he did not trust the code to hold them for a single day. Loyalty, in his mouth, was never a virtue he actually practiced. It was a leash he strapped onto other people. And the final proof of that is the boy he said it to. Henry Hill, arrested in 1980 and staring down a long sentence, did the one thing Jimmy Burke had built his entire life to prevent. He flipped, and he took the whole ledger with him. He sat in a federal courtroom and testified against Jimmy Burke and Paul Vario both. The kid who had learned the code better than any of them was the one who broke it and walked away breathing. Vario died in a federal prison in 1988. Burke went down on the word of the teenager he had once handed a roll of bills outside a courthouse. Take the second scene, the phone booth. In the film, Jimmy learns that Tommy is dead and destroys a phone booth in silent animal fury. That is not invented. Pileggi describes the real Burke slamming a phone receiver down onto the hook again and again with everything he had when the bad news reached him. A man built entirely out of control, briefly coming apart at the seams. The movie got the gesture exactly right. It simply could never tell you how many of the deaths that put that look on his face had been ordered by Burke himself. And then take the one scene the movie never shows you at all. Late in Goodfellas, there is an image people never forget. A body, frozen solid, discovered in the back of a refrigerated meat truck. In the film, it belongs to a character named Frankie Carbone, one more casualty of the paranoid purge. That frozen body is real. But the real one was not part of the Lufthansa crew, and his death had nothing to do with the heist. His name was Richard Eaton, and he had swindled Jimmy Burke on a cocaine deal worth around $250,000. 2 children playing in a dead-end, garbage-strewn Brooklyn lot found his body in an abandoned refrigerated trailer in February of 1979. He had been hogtied and left to freeze. Prosecutors said he was strangled. Burke, by one account, insisted the man had simply died of the cold, as if that were a defense. Detectives found a small address book sewn into the lining of Eaton's coat, and inside it was Jimmy Burke's name, his address, and his phone number. That was the thread they pulled. When the case finally reached a courtroom, years later, on the testimony of Henry Hill, it produced the only murder conviction of Jimmy Burke's entire life. Hill testified that Burke had told him about Eaton not to worry, that he had whacked the swindler out. On February the 19th, 1985, James Burke was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years to life for the killing of Richard Eaton. Set that fact against the legend. Here was a man that Henry Hill claimed had a hand in dozens of killings, a man an old FBI memo once linked to as many as 50 murders, and the state of New York could put him away for exactly one of them. And then the film came along and took that single homicide, the one crime the law could actually prove against him, changed the victim's name, moved the body into a different story about a different man, and handed the most haunting image of his real crimes to a character who never existed. That is not the movie getting a detail wrong. That is the movie doing the one thing Jimmy Burke spent his whole life doing, making the truth disappear. The rest of the ledger closed the way these things always close, without a shred of glory in it. Henry Hill vanished into witness protection, spent his remaining years selling his story to anyone who would buy it, and died in California in 2012. Burke's own son Frank, who had driven a car the night of the robbery, was shot to death by a drug dealer in 1987, and his father grieved him from a prison cell. And Jimmy Burke, the man who had planned the perfect crime and then murdered his way out of its consequences, died of lung cancer in state custody on April the 13th, 1996, 64 years old, having never spent one free day from the moment Henry Hill said his name out loud in that courtroom. Even death did not close his account. Just when the story seemed finally buried, the ground gave it back. Back in June of 1980, investigators had dug up the basement of Robert's Lounge, that patch behind the bar hill called the makeshift graveyard, and pulled human bones out of it, though what exactly they had found stayed disputed for years afterward. And then, decades on, in the summer of 2013, the FBI came back with cadaver dogs and jackhammers to a row house in Ozone Park that Burke had once owned, a house now lived in by his daughter. Under the concrete they found human remains, and this time they had a name for them. The bones belonged to a man named Paul Katz, who had vanished back in 1969, suspected by Burke and his associates of being an informant. That discovery pulled one more old Lufthansa name into a courtroom, a Bonanno figure named Vincent Asaro, who was tried for the heist and the Katz murder, and, astonishingly, acquitted of all of it in 2015. He died a free man in 2023. 35 years after the money left that terminal, the machine was still turning up bodies it could not quite convict anyone for. That was the world Jimmy Burke built, and it kept his secrets almost as well as he did. So, no, it was not the gun that made Jimmy Burke dangerous, and it was not the nerve or the planning either. It was the $50 bill. It was the warmth. It was the fact that the same open hand that tipped a terrified truck driver was the hand that decided, in perfect calm, which of his own friends would not be coming home. Every man he killed had, at some point, taken money and a smile from Jimmy Burke, and felt lucky to know him. For most of them, that was the last thing they ever felt.